Howdy folks, J. Scott Phillips here, and I hear tell June on the Range is back in town. So today we are bound for the Old West with a look at Zane Gray's novel Nevada, first serialized in the American magazine starting in its November 1926 issue, and then published monthly in installments all the way up through its May 1927 issue. 7 months it took to tell that story properly. And so we'll try to take a proper look at it here. I've just read it for the first time, and specifically for June on the Range. So we'll chat about that for a little bit. And then, like I usually like to do on my channel here, is to talk about some of the artwork that goes along with the stories that I like to discuss on my channel. And having been serialized in the American magazine back in the heyday of magazines, it had a lot of great illustrations. Way too many to talk about it just in this one video, so we'll just look at a handful of them. And then we'll also look at some book covers on the various editions that were published for Nevada down since decades past. But I guess I should start off with mentioning this is an offering of mine for June on the Range, which is a now perennial BookTube event that was created a few years ago by Michael K. Vaughan to encourage us all to read Westerns, that great old American genre of fiction that once ruled the bookstores and train stations and radio and television and movies. And now a bit of a dying breed, unfortunately, but with his encouragement, we can all get back to reading some Westerns and enjoy the fun and adventure of those glorious days of yesteryear. So he's got a great posse of co-hosts. I'll list them in the notes down below. I'm not a co-host myself. I'm just hitching my wagon to the train and hitting the trail for some fun and adventure here. And starting off with the Zane Grey book. Now, Michael K. Vaughan has some prompts that he is recommending to take full advantage of June on the Range, which you can ignore completely. Really, all you got to do is read a Western, and you're along for the ride. But he is recommending that you read a novel by Zane Grey, then a novel by Louis L'Amour, and then 2 other novels by anybody other than Zane Grey and Louis L'Amour. So if you do all that, then you're in good standing with June on the Range. But as long as you're reading a Western, you're in good company. So I decided to start off June on the Range by reading a Zane Grey book. And I have been a Western fan most of my life. I grew up watching Westerns on TV and the movies. And then once I got into reading more often and reading more adult fiction, reading Westerns, and in particular Louis L'Amour. I think I've only read one Zane Grey book that I know for sure, and that was Riders of the Purple Sage. And to be honest, I don't really remember too much about it. I was reading a lot of Westerns at that time, and so it probably just blended together with a lot of the other ones. But since Zane Grey is one of the prompts for June on the Range, I thought I probably should, just for my own benefit, is really go back and read a Zane Grey. So I didn't have any, so I decided to go to a local used bookstore, Half Off Books, in Fullerton, and look for specifically a Zane Grey book for June on the Range. And I came across this paperback here, this old Bantam paperback, because I picked this one out because I thought this is an illustration by James Bama, one of my favorite illustrators. So I picked that one up and read that, and so here we are today. Now, before we get into that, let's talk just a little bit about the author himself, Zane Grey, and see where we're coming from here. Zane Grey was born in 1872 in Zanesville, Ohio, a town that was actually founded by his own grandfather, hence the name Zanesville. And as a kid, he was an avid reader of adventure stories, and he got interested in writing his own stories. He had a brother who is his best friend through life, really, And as kids, they were pretty adventurous, and even into their adult years, they would love to go on expeditions and fishing trips. They got into sports fishing, and in their teenage years, they got into playing baseball. And Zane Grey himself actually wound up going to the University of Pennsylvania on a baseball scholarship, and he was studying dentistry, of all things, which back in those days consisted primarily of tooth pulling. But after college, he found that his true calling really was writing, so he left the dentistry behind. And then a few years later, in 1900, Zane Grey was 28 years old, and he was on a fishing trip on the upper Delaware River. And at a nearby train station there, he met this 17-year-old girl, very pretty girl by the name of Lena Roth, who went by Dolly. And they hit it off and started a very passionate and stormy relationship. And they got married 5 years later, 1905. They got married. But Zane Grey had a number of girlfriends that he continued to see. And Dolly was not particularly happy with that, but she accepted it as kind of a personal handicap of Zane's, and just kind of dealt with it on that kind of a level somehow. He continued to, they would go on trips together, but he would just as often as not go with just his brother or with a mistress or two on expeditions and just exploring the world, going on these big fishing trips and just all over the world, really. Sometimes Dolly was along, often she was not. But Dolly took it on herself to kind of manage his writing career, manage and deal with all the publishers and just take care of his profession, his professional life, really. And it was pretty well known that Dolly, dealing with all that she did, she was really the glue that was holding their family together. Now, by the time he wrote Nevada, which was in 1926, Zane Grey was already becoming the most popular author in the country, if not the world, you might almost say. And he was almost single-handedly creating the American Western as the genre we still know today. He was making about $300,000 a year in 1926, which is a little more than $5 million in today's economy. So he was doing really well. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that not only was he very prolific, and he had thousands and thousands and thousands of eager fans waiting for the next Zane Grey story to come out, but Hollywood was also calling. They were very hungry for stories, for Westerns in particular. They were a great type of genre to shoot in the locations and things. And by the way, when Zane Grey agreed to have his stories shot as Westerns, he would always insist that they be shot on location because he was in love with the land and thought that the American West was just a beautiful countryside and should not be shot on a set or against matte paintings, things like that. He wanted them shot on location. And Hollywood was happy to comply with that because they were bringing in a lot of money. And these were still silent films in those days. They called them odors, the early Westerns. And so because he was selling so many of his stories to the movies, his serialization fees were spiraling up through the roof like no other author of his time. And then not only that, when a movie came out, that kind of spurred the secondary, no pun intended, spurred secondary sales of the novels that the movies were based on. So he just kept raking in the money. And in fact, when he wrote Nevada, 1926, and he sold the serialization to American Magazine, he sold it for $40,000 just for the serialization. And then in 1928, Paramount bought the rights to film the silent movie for Nevada, starring Gary Cooper and the lovely Thelma Todd, and paid him $70,000 for the film rights for that. And this was happening with all of his books, really. He was just making money hand over fist in those days. So he was doing very well. in 1926 when this book came out. He had his critics, and that was causing some problems. But as far as his fans went and the money that was coming in and the sales of his stories, he was doing very well. Now, let's talk about this book here that I just read. As I say, I've never read it before, and it's often you will see the title Nevada with quotes around it. They're very small on this particular cover. Usually they're larger than that, but they're in there as small as they might be. And why is that? You know, you'll often see grammatically if someone is writing the title of a book in running copy, that you will grammatically and properly put the title of a book in quotes. But you don't usually see that on a book itself. There's no need to do that because you can tell it's a book. But Nevada seems to do that a lot. And I think it's because Nevada is not the name of the state. It's the name of a guy. It's a nickname. So his real name is Jim Lacey. So he's Jim Nevada Lacey. But it's because it's a kind of an anonymous nickname, Nevada is. That's because he's got a bit of a checkered past. He has been a notorious outlaw and gunslinger in his day. Basically a good guy, and that all comes out in this book here. But he got off to a bad start running with the wrong folks and all that, and was a lethal gunman. But he ran into a rancher in Northern California. This is all the backstory here. And saved the ranch, saved the guy, saved his whole family. It was Ben Ide was his name. He was the rancher, and his family, his wife Ida and his lovely sister Hetty, and others. And so they became very close and would go and hunt wild horses together, and the ranch would flourish and all of this. And so early on in their relationship, Ben Ide asked him what his name was, naturally, and he didn't want to say his name because it was a kind of a bad guy name in those days, like right up there with Billy the Kid and others. So he didn't want to give his real name, so he just said he was from Nevada. So Ben just called him Nevada, and that's all. It's the only name that the Ide family ever knew him by. And then there's a lot of exposition at the beginning of this book, and it actually was kind of tough to get into, really. It was interesting. I shouldn't say it was tough to get into. I guess I should say it was just a kind of a slow starter. A lot of backstory going on. And at the beginning of the story, Nevada has to kill someone at the Ide Ranch, and then he hightails it out of there. And the last thing he says, he looks over his shoulder as he's galloping out of the corral there. He looks back at Ben and says, "So long, pard," and off he goes, thinking he'll never see Ben Ide or any of that family ever again. He's just taken on the lam. And then we hear more and more backstory, and it turns out that that's because that all happened in another book. I didn't realize that Nevada was a sequel. There was a book that came before this called Forlorn River. And that was the whole story about how Jim Lacey came to be known as Nevada to, I'm assuming, I've never read it, but it seems like they're kind of catching you up what came before this book in the first few chapters of Nevada. But the nickname Nevada is kind of funny because Jim Lacey himself is from Texas. So he's not really from Nevada. And in fact, his gunslinging days that he's trying to leave behind him all come from things that apparently happened in Idaho. So so he's known as Nevada from Texas, made his past in Idaho, and then this whole book takes place almost exclusively in Arizona, and yet Jim Lacey, or Nevada as he's most often called in the book, talks with a Canadian accent. So what's that about? I don't know, but it's an interesting choice of names. And then even later on in the book, he is known by another group of ranchers in Arizona as Texas Jack. So I try to keep keep track of all those place names and nicknames and things. It gets a little convoluted, but all one guy, and he is the good guy in the story, and we follow him along. Now, as I was saying, he has to leave the Ide Ranch at the beginning of this story, and he winds up in Arizona. Now, the impetus of the story here, really from the beginning, other than being introduced to Jim Lacey, or Nevada, as we best know him at the beginning of the story, we're then taken back to the Ide Ranch in Northern California. The Ide Ranch is right on the border of California and Oregon, and they're up in the Mount Shasta area, that region. And we are sitting with them on the railing of the corral of the Ide Ranch, and they're talking about their long-lost friend and really family member, partner in life and in the ranch, all of that, Nevada. Nevada is beloved to this family, and will they ever see him again? And they kind of recall that Nevada talked about maybe someday he might get a spread of his own, maybe in Arizona. He loved Arizona, the rolling countryside there, and it just always thought that it was just beautiful and peaceful. Well, at the same time now, their mother is very ill. She's getting sicker and sicker every year at wintertime, and looks like she's kind of heading for the last roundup. So what can they possibly do? Well, the doctors in San Francisco tell them that the winters are going to kill her. You've just got to move her out of here and she'll do a lot better. And they thought, well, if we're ever going to see Nevada again, he might be in Arizona. Maybe that would be a perfect place for Mom anyway, for the winters in Arizona are going to be great. So let's pull up stakes and move the ranch, take a few of our trusted ranch hands here, move to Arizona. And so the next several chapters are about that, and that, of course, there are adventures along the way there. And, of course, Nevada has settled there, but he's going by a completely different name. He's trying to leave his notorious past and now his days of Nevada in the past. He is also pining for Hetty, of course, and he has turned over a new leaf. He no longer wants to do any outlaw stuff ever anymore because he's a changed man now, having been a beneficiary of Hetty's true love. So the story then becomes one of this conflict of his notorious past and trying to turn over a new leaf for love and friendship of the Ide family, although he thinks he will never see them again. Of course, they're slowly coming together here, and Zane Grey really milks that tension through the whole book. They're just getting closer and closer and closer, but then there are things that keep them apart. I recommend this book. There's a lot going on. There is a lot to do in this book about love and friendship, loyalty, turning over a new leaf. Of course, it's another Save the Ranch story. That's always a trope in a lot of Westerns. And it's just a lot of fun. Once it gets going and we get past all the exposition at the beginning, in case we haven't read that first book, Forlorn River, it really rolls right along, and Zane Grey does a great job in describing the countryside. They settle around the Mogollon Rim, and that's an actual place as part of the Colorado Plateau in central Arizona. And it's not here, I'll put a picture of it up here so you can kind of get an idea. It's not just the unending desert that you might think of as the hot, barren, cactus-ridden Arizona landscape, but it's very lush and green, pine forests and streams and rivers and these rocky steps up to the plateau, and it's just gorgeous. And Zane Grey's descriptions are very poetic, very descriptive. You really, if you've never seen the landscape before, you can picture it in your mind. Kind of hard to place it in Arizona, but it's actually there. And Zane Grey would often visit there. He wrote a lot of his books apparently around the same region, and one of his favorite spots. These are some of the adventurous trips that he would take with his wife and various mistresses, his brother from time to time. But he really knew that land, and he could describe it so well. and sunsets in particular. And usually or at least when I read a lot of books, when they get too descriptive in the settings and things, it seems like it's kind of bogging down, taken away from the action. I have to say, Zane Grey, not so. He really paints that picture, and you can just imagine being there. You can smell the pine trees in the air. And in fact, even some of the bad guys in the story, when they're camping out for the night, are kind of soaking in the environment, just the surroundings, the starry night and the pine forest and the babbling brooks and all that. Even the bad guys are in love with the nature in their little world there. So, and it doesn't really slow the story down at all. It just wraps you in that world, and then you can really feel like you're in that action, and you can feel the canyons and things surrounding you down in the breaks and the foothills underneath that plateau. Really great. I was really surprised at how compelling that was for me. All right, now let's talk about some artwork for a little while here. And as I said earlier, the serialization, the first publication of Nevada in American Magazine, was from November 1926 for 7 months through the May 1927 issue. And through those 7 months, the artist Stockton Mulford gave us 21 beautiful illustrations that ran 2, 3, 4, or 5 illustrations per installment. Again, as I say, for a total of 21. That's way too many to talk about in this video here, so we're just going to look at 5 of them and some kind of significant turning points in the story, and you get a sense of his style and just how great illustrations were back in these magazines back in the day. Now, I will say that since they do talk about certain story points, there can be some spoilers here, some probably minor spoilers, but if you have never read it and you don't want any spoilers, then put the video on pause, go read Nevada, and then come back, and then we'll take a look at these illustrations together. If you don't care about the spoilers, if you have read it, then saddle up, and here we go. Here is the very first illustration of Nevada himself on the first page of the first serialization in that November 1926 issue of the American Magazine. And as a longtime art director myself professionally, one of the things I've always loved book art and illustration. One of the things I always look for in particular is how accurate are the illustrations to the description in the books. Very often you'll get kind of a generic take on something that's not quite the description in the story. Sometimes it's just blatantly different. It just is a generic, completely generic image that has almost sometimes nothing to do with anything mentioned in the book. And we may see some of those in some covers that we get to here in a minute. But as far as Stockton Mulford goes, he nailed it. I think he probably read the story that he was illustrating, because there is so much care in all 21 of his illustrations, this one being the first one. And one of the big giveaways here is that Nevada is always described as wearing a sombrero, not a cowboy hat, but particularly a sombrero. And if you often think of the traditional sombrero that we usually will think of, they're a lot more ornate than what we see here. And that's because we have come to be used to the more ornate style where the big broad brim curls up, and then that area where the brim curls up gives the wearer an opportunity to add some decoration and some bling around the brim, and it's a lot more festive, or more formal, perhaps, in a lot of cases. Not so with the utilitarian hat that was worn just by old cowpunchers and things. There were a lot flatter brim, big, broad, flat brim, and then the crown was usually either a conical or a big, round, tall hat. And this is just kind of one of the rabbit holes that I'll go down sometimes, is that I looked up some of the history of the sombrero, and it turns out that it's based on the Spanish term, the 10-gallon hat. And that's where the term 10-gallon hat comes from. But the Spanish term means very gallant. So it was considered to be a kind of a flashy big hat, and then it was anglicized by American cowboys to be a 10-gallon hat, which to me growing up, and probably to you too, always sounded like, well, it's just such a big hat, it can hold 10 gallons of water. And it's not quite that big, but that's where the term came from. So when we see Nevada wearing a sombrero, we're actually following the intended description that Zane Grey gave us in the text. Now, another illustration still from that first issue, the November 26 issue here. The story starts off actually with a flashback, I think, from the end of the novel that came before, Forlorn River, also by Zane Grey, where we see Nevada is hightailing it out of the Ide Ranch there, where he has just had to kill 3 men, and they're lying there on the ground with all the ranch hands as we see Nevada rushing off on his horse, hightailing out of town. And on the far left, we see Ben Ide and his lovely sister Hetty seeing Nevada run off for probably the last time. They are hoping to find him again someday. But this is just a nice example of these big, juicy, double spread illustrations that we would get in magazines of the day, where they wrap the type around it. And these were not small magazine pages like we have today either. These were big tabloid size magazines. The next illustration we'll look at here is from the second issue of the serialization, December 1926. And if you'll notice, I didn't mention this in the first illustration here, but we see the title Nevada in those quotes again. That will come up often here. But this is a flashback scene that I mentioned earlier, where we see Ben and Hetty Ide sitting on the fence around the corral at the Ide Ranch at Tule Lake in Northern California. And here's where they're hearkening back to missing their beloved Nevada, who is run off at the beginning of the story here. I think this is about 4 years later now after that. And they're looking at the horse that we see on the right there. That is California Red. That's Ben's prized horse that he and Nevada caught together when they were out chasing wild horses and bringing them in for their ranch. And this particular horse is a deep red, coppery color that just lights up brilliant red in the sunset. And just a beautiful, beautiful horse with a wild spirit. And I think that Zane Grey may be giving us this horse to kind of foreshadow some of Nevada's particular character and things that are going to happen to him later in the story. He's kind of that wild stallion who's been running wild and is now tamed and domesticated, but still has that spirit. And I think he's kind of a metaphor for Nevada himself. See what you think once you read the story, if you get any of that. This next illustration is from the January 1927 issue of American Magazine, and we're in Arizona now. These are Arizona ranchers Tom Day and Judge Frankledge. They're sitting on Tom Day's porch one afternoon talking about a problem they've been having with the gangs of rustlers that have been raiding their herds, and in particular the herds of the newcomer Ben Ide. He's just settled into the neighborhood here and is having trouble. He's been swindled into buying this particular ranch in the first place, so he's not getting any kind of a breaks. But Tom Day, a local rancher, has already befriended him, and so they're kind of looking out for each other, and Tom Day in particular. And then the third person standing there, that is Tom Day's trusted rancher, Texas Jack, who has been overhearing them talking about the rustlers and that Ben Ide and his family have just moved into town. And of course, Texas Jack is none other than the notorious Jim Lacey, or as we know him as the beloved Nevada. And now he is throwing his sombrero down on the deck there on the porch, and he says, well, he knows one way to get rid of these rustlers. And to himself, he knows that he's got to do something to save his friends, but he can't let them know that he's Jim Lacey. So he's still undercover. He's going to turn back into Jim Lacey to become what he needs to become in order to help them save their ranch, much like he did before, but he's just got to be incognito. And then this is the last of the Mulford illustrations that we'll talk about here. But this is maybe halfway through the story, and it's a real turning point here. We're in Arizona again, in town now, and Hetty has been shopping at the dry goods store. That's her there standing looking out the door at this figure walking down the street. And a moment before this, there had been gunshots ringing out, and everyone has heard that Jim Lacey's in town, and there's going to be trouble. And sure enough, gunshots ring out, and Hetty looks out the window, and she sees a dead man lying in the middle of the street. And then here comes this man, who everyone is saying is Jim Lacey, the notorious Jim Lacey, walks up, looks down at the body, and then strolls away, and his gun is still kind of smoking. But Hetty recognizes him as her beloved Nevada, and now everything just kind of starts to fall apart and at the same time kind of come together. So we'll leave it at that as far as the Stockton Mulford illustrations for the American Magazine. But I'll just put up on the screen here real quick so you can see all 21 illustrations. And if you want to, I'm hoping you can pause and zoom in on any of them if your device will allow you to do such a thing, if you want a closer look. But I think you'll get a good sense of just how rich these magazine illustrations were back in the day. And maybe give you an idea as to why I miss that kind of a thing so much. I wish we still had such a thing. Now let's take a look at some actual book covers that followed that initial run of illustrations in American Magazine. And we'll start off with the first edition cover, which was published in 1928 by Harper & Brothers. And if it looks familiar, it should, because once again, our artist is Stockton Mulford. And what he's given us here is a full-color painting of his introductory illustration of Nevada from the first page of the serialization. And because he had to add a little bit more artwork to the left side of it, because it wanted to wrap around the spine of the book, we get to see a little bit more of that rock wall, and then he added that cool blue shadow being cast by Nevada and the horse. So that's kind of cool. And then if we were to remove the dust jacket, we would see that once again now there is a line drawing version of the same thing on the cover, and then just a little portrait headshot of Nevada on the spine. And then one of the cool things about this first edition here is that when you opened the book up, it had some more illustrations, once again from the American Magazine illustrations, a couple illustrations by Stockton Mulford on the end papers, front and back, 2 different illustrations. So that was kind of a little extra bonus. No illustrations throughout the book, but you did get those end papers. Oh, and for some reason, I want to point out that the title Nevada is still in the quotes. So all through the Depression then and into the war years, this was the edition that people had. Or it came out in several editions, later editions, but all the hardback editions, sometimes the cover underneath the jacket would be red, maybe it was yellow or blue or green, something like that, would change out. And it was printed on fairly cheap paper and all that for the economy of the day. But in the mid-40s by then, paperback books were becoming very popular, and Bantam Books got the rights to print Nevada. And we'll just take a look at the first 3 of the Bantam editions, but they all had one characteristic in common. I think it's pretty apparent here. We see our hero, Nevada, on the cover of each, walking through the Batwing doors into a saloon. That's a pretty grand entrance, and I'm just wondering, did those Batwing doors open by themselves? And if not, what's holding them open? Don't know, but because these 3 have so many similarities, it's kind of fun to compare them and nitpick them a little bit, which is one of the things I love to do anyway. First of all, none of our Nevadas here are wearing the sombrero. They're all wearing the flat-brim cowboy hat, so probably doesn't matter, but it's one of those details that is incorrect if this is supposed to be Nevada. And then I hesitate to point out that there are a lot of red shirts going on here, and that not only is June the month of June on the Range, but it is also the launching date for Book Trek, Summer of Trek. and red shirts might be a little bit of a disadvantage in that case. But fortunately, that's another story. And then this must take place early in the story in this little town called Lineville, which is really the only time we get a saloon at all. And that's when Nevada is traveling from Northern California on the lam to Arizona. He stops off for a time in the little town of Lineville on the California-Nevada border. Looking specifically at the cover on the left by artist David Triggs, that's the 1945 Bantam edition there. And unfortunately for me, Nevada looks pretty wooden and stiff in this painting here. It's almost doll-like and is the weakest of the three in my estimation. The cover in the middle, the 1952 Bantam paperback, I think is a lot better. And not just because the artist's name is Phillips here. We don't have a first name, so don't know who that is, if he's any relation or not. Probably not, even though it's a perfectly fine last name. Don't have a first name. But if I were to pick up this one apart a little bit, it might just be that he is not as stiff and wooden as the one on the left, but he does look like he's just kind of posing maybe for an old Montgomery Ward catalog or something for the Western wear section, perhaps. But for me, it's the 1962 edition on the far right that is the winner of all these. Very similar in composition to the one on the left by Triggs, but the one on the right, the 62 edition, we have an uncredited artist, so I can't really give any background on whoever gave us this illustration, except that, and compared to the other two, this one works best for me, probably because Nevada is standing there. At least he's in a pose, he's in a stance ready for action here. And I think he's making a good entrance. And that cover, I think, probably looked the best on a rack of books in a bookshop or at a newsstand or something back in the day. Of these three, that's my favorite. Now, this next one is the very edition that I picked up for my Zane Grey assignment for June on the Range here. And it's got the cover by James Bama, one of my favorite illustrators. And in fact, he is the artist that did that very first NBC promotional illustration for Star Trek back in 1966 that was used on the cover of James Blish's first collection of Star Trek episode adaptations. I did a more of an in-depth look at that series and of the James Bama cover in particular in another video. If you're interested in James Bama, I'll leave a link to it down below, and I talk more about some of his other artwork in that as well and some of his background if you're interested. If not, we can just move along here and we'll talk about this particular James Bama cover. As a James Bama fan, I wanted to say that this is my favorite cover of all the Nevada covers we're looking at here. But I can't really do that because I don't think that this was actually painted for the cover of Nevada. This is not Nevada on the cover, and I don't think it's any of the bad guys from the story. I guess it could be, but why would you put them on the cover? We don't have, obviously there's no sombrero or any hat of any kind, so at least that isn't wrong. But the thing that is wrong is the bloody bandage around his head. There's no scene in the book where his scalp or head gets injured at all, so that's not accurate to the story itself. And then another giveaway is that he's shooting those two guns there, and Jim Lacey, or Nevada, only had the one sidearm. He didn't have two, so I think this was probably a James Bama illustration that Bantam had the rights to use, and a Western is a Western, so they just slapped it on the cover here and went with that. Aside from that, it does have that very 1970 psychedelic typography there, and if you look very closely, like I tried to point out earlier, it still does have those tiny little quotations around the title Nevada, for whatever that's worth at this point. But I really like the artwork, and I like the open cleanness of the cover overall. I just wish it had been for this book. Now we'll move up to the 1990s here for these next couple of covers, and starting with the one on the left, still by Bantam Books, published in 1990. We have an uncredited artist here, which is a shame to me. I always think artists should be credited, but here they are not. And I don't recognize the style. There's not enough for me to go by anyway, but it looks sophisticated enough to me that this is a practiced hand here. They know what they're doing, I think, that if we did have a name to pin on it, we would probably recognize it. However, the art director and me still can't help but comment on the authenticity for the character based on the book's description. Again, we're still missing that sombrero I keep harping on for some reason, and doesn't really look like the description of Jim Lacey or Nevada from the book. This looks to me like a model, and I'm sure whoever the illustrator is painting from a model, and they got some cowboy wardrobe. Looks like a pretty modern 1880s cowboy to me. And one of the giveaways here is that bandolier that he's got slung over his shoulder. We never hear that Nevada wears such a belt full of bullets there. But if you look at his sidearm there, his pistol, and I don't know guns that well, but that the cartridges in that bandolier look a little heavy duty for that sidearm to me. I might be wrong on that, but those look a lot more heavy duty, I think, than that gun could support. The cover on the right is really disappointing to me for a couple of reasons. At least it's published by Harper, which was the original publisher of the first edition back in 1928. But now in 1994, their paperback edition leaves a lot to be desired for me. For one, we no longer are getting original cover art. We're falling back on photography. Now, I will say that the photography at least is an interesting choice because it's by H. Armstrong Roberts, who lived from 1843 to 1947, and he was known for his great photography of very dramatic scenes that were pretty well art directed, I think, of Americana, Western Americana in particular. And he had a lot of great photography through his career. But this has nothing to do with the character of Nevada. Now, I will say that the geese flying overhead there can be a tip that this is Ben-eyed. And this would take place early in the story when Ben is still up in his ranch in Northern California. And there's a scene where he is seeing the geese flying home after the winter, coming into the spring months now. And things are looking up. Mom is getting healthier, and now that the winter's over. And I think the geese here are another metaphor for Nevada, because he's wishing that someday maybe Nevada would come home like the geese are here in this scene. Now, these last two covers that we'll take a look at do have great art on the cover. I'll give you that. However, unfortunately, it is not great cover art. And what I mean by that is that they are just picking up great art from a couple of artists from over 100 years ago that was produced for completely different reasons, independent reasons. And if we look at the book on the left, that was published in 1995 by Bison Books. That's an imprint of the University of Nebraska Press. And this is the authorized edition of the Zane Grey estate. And this is just a travesty to me, really. This is the authorized edition. Zane Grey's own estate is printing a book that has cover art that has nothing to do with his story at all. In fact, this is artwork by N.C. Wyeth from a painting that he did in 1906 to illustrate a short story series called Arizona Nights by Stewart Edward White. And the title of this painting is probably lifted from a line in one of the short stories. The title of this painting is, "I Saw His Horse Jump Back Dodging a Rattlesnake," or something. And has nothing to do with Nevada, unfortunately. Now, I don't really mind when a publisher picks up artwork from an independent source, as long as it is appropriate for the book, has something to do with the book. But in this case, it just doesn't. Now, there's no lasso play in Nevada. There's no such scene like this at all anywhere in the book. I'm going to harp on the sombrero. We still have no sombrero here. We don't even have the little quotes around the title Nevada in the type. And Zane Gray's name itself is just so small. This is from his estate. It should be prominent on the cover. It's just, to me, a very poor showing for an authorized edition from Zane Gray's own estate. And then the book on the right is the most recent of all the books that we've looked at today. This one was published just earlier this year by Open Road Media. And this is the Kindle edition. So again, great art on the cover, but it is just not Nevada. This is actually a painting by Frederic Remington, and it's called The Scout. And there is no scouting in this book at all. Nevada himself is clean shaven. He doesn't have a mustache like that. And he didn't wear buckskins. He didn't carry a rifle. He just had that sidearm that we talked about before. But at least we get a sombrero. So I'll give you that, Frederic Remington. Then let's get into the type here. We don't have the quotes around Nevada again, so that's an oversight. And again, Zane Gray's name is just so small. He's the big name in early Western fiction. That should be much larger, I would think, even on a modern Kindle book. People are going to buy this because it's Zane Grey, not because it's Nevada. I do like the composition of the cover, though. It's nice and clean, good use of the type, I think, except for those quotes. And it's a nice font choice. The painting lays out nicely in the frame. It's just too bad that the artwork isn't for this book. And then one last thing I'm going to do here is put up a little wagon train of book covers that we just chatted about. And as they're scrolling by, see if you spot a favorite cover of yours out of the batch. And then maybe in the comments, let me know why it's your favorite. And it's always nice to know the why behind a favorite choice. For me, it's that first edition cover by Mulford, that full color illustration, for a couple reasons. And one, it's been reprinted the most as far as illustrations for this book, and has just become iconic. And also, Mulford himself just gets all the details right from the very beginning, all the way down from that sombrero that I keep obsessing over, all the way down to the location there on the Mogollon Rim is just a great setting. So that cover art really wouldn't be as fitting on any other Western, I don't feel. So let me also know in the comments if what did you think of the magazine illustrations? Maybe those are your favorite out of the batch, aside from the cover art. Have you read Nevada yourself, or maybe the prequel, Forlorn River? Are you a Zane Grey fan? Have you got a favorite Zane Grey book? Let me know. I know that Zane Grey's son, Romer Zane Grey, has written another Jim Lacey Nevada novel called Beyond the Mogollon Rim. I haven't read it. Maybe you've read that. Let me know. And maybe you've got a different favorite Western author. Let's chat about stuff like that. It's fun. That's the whole reason we're doing this, is to open up dialogues about the books we're reading anyway. So let me know. And there you have it, folks. That wraps up this video for Nevada by Zane Grey. And I want to thank once again Michael K. Vaughn for creating June on the Range, and also a tip of the sombrero to his posse. And it was a lot of fun chatting, a lot of fun putting this together again. I love being able to show old magazine illustrations because they are just usually lost to history somehow. So it's nice to be able to share those when we come across them here. And until we get a chance to chat again, happy trails.